Once every year, there's a night when a knock at the door hours after the sun has gone down doesn't raise concern or warrant a cautious glance out the front window. Across the country, thousands of doors fly almost instantly open to swarms of children hidden behind creepy masks, hungry for candy, regardless of how heavy their bag has gotten. For the most part, it's a night of pretend scares and laughter, but sometimes the person on the other side of the door isn't just pretending to be a monster. 39 years ago, Marvin and Ethel Brandland were preparing to retire after a long night of handing out candy. Then came another knock at the door. Minutes later, a gunshot rang out and Marvin fell to the floor as the shooter disappeared back into the night. Left behind on the kitchen floor was the pillowcase the killer had worn over his head. Police arriving on the scene began a sweep of the entire neighborhood, looking for witnesses and the unknown assailant. Despite Ethel having seen the shooter's face, investigators couldn't track down the killer, and as time went on, it began to seem like they never would. While locals worried that the murderer might come knocking at their door, Marvin's family began to believe that the crime may have been carried out by someone they already knew. This is Trace Evidence, episode 178, The Murder of Marvin Brandland. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the murder of Marvin Brandland, a case which, despite the passage of decades, continues to be as disturbing and frustrating as it was nearly 40 years ago. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. You can follow the show on social media on Twitter @TraceEvPod, Instagram @TraceEvidencePod, or by searching Facebook for Trace Evidence. If you're interested in supporting the show and getting some Trace Evidence merch, there's a Patreon at patreon.com/TraceEvidence. Or you can donate directly via PayPal. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or email me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Marvin and Ethel Brandland had spent the previous 46 years together. They built a life, raised children, and settled into a quiet home in Fort Dodge, Iowa. Then, one October night in 1982, an unknown killer entered their home and ended a seemingly unbreakable bond in a moment of madness. This is episode 178, The Murder of Marvin Brandland. Every year when October grows short, thousands of costumed children flood the streets in search of candy and scares. While the children worry about tales of haunted houses, bloodthirsty vampires, and the howling of werewolves, no one truly believes their night will transform into a real-life horror story. But we all know behind the silliness of urban legends and that one house where no one's courageous enough to knock on the front door, there are monsters lurking in the shadows eager to live out their twisted fantasies on the unsuspecting. Not with green skin and red eyes, but looking just like you and I. And that's what makes them truly scary. In 1982, one of them was walking the streets of an Iowa town. After the rush of trick-or-treaters had begun to slow, many homes switched off their porch lights and snacked on what candy remained, having escaped the clutches of another child's pumpkin-shaped basket. Marvin and Ethel Brandland were ready to call it a night themselves when one last knock came thumping at the door. Unbeknownst to the Brandlands, this visitor wasn't looking for a piece of chocolate. Just moments before his fist had hammered against the front door, the looming figure pulled a pillowcase over his head and tucked a gun into his waistband. Minutes later, a gunshot would destroy a life and shatter a family. Marvin Clarence Brandland was born on Monday, March 24, 1913 in Sweet Township, Pipestone County, Minnesota, to parents Peter and Clara. Marvin was the sixth-born child of the Brandlands, eventually going on to have 5 brothers and 3 sisters. Both Peter and Clara's families immigrated to the United States in the late 19th century from their native Norway. At the time of Marvin's birth, his father was 35 years old and worked predominantly as a farmer. On some census records, Clara is listed as also performing general farm work, while other forms show her as a homemaker. As was often the case at the turn of the century, families like Marvin's often had a lot of children, though sadly some wouldn't make it past the first few years. Just 6 years prior to his birth, Marvin's parents had a son, Martin, who passed away when he was only a year old. The couple had their ninth and final child in February of 1919. Tragically, just 2 years later, in February of 21, Marvin's mother died at the age of 36. Peter never remarried, keeping a close bond with his children, particularly Marvin. Little's known about Marvin's early years outside of the general knowledge of the hard conditions his family experienced and the challenges of growing up with little to no money and no mother by the time he was 8 years old. According to military records, Marvin attended school only through the 8th grade, at which time he joined the workforce, as was the way things were done back then. Despite the early termination of his education, Marvin was an intelligent teenager who could read and write proficiently. Many described him as a kind soul, the type to help out without hesitation, whatever the challenge might be. Sweet Township shared a border to the west with South Dakota, and with everything being so close, it wasn't uncommon for work to call Marvin and his family back and forth across the line. In the early 1930s, Marvin, then in his 20s, found a much more important reason to make that trip: Ethel May Hansen. The two would fall quickly in love, and after their courtship, Marvin proposed and Ethel accepted. On Saturday, October 3rd, 1936, the couple were married in Flandreau, Moody County, South Dakota. According to their marriage certificate, they would both now be living together in Pipestone County. Marvin was 23 and Ethel was 24. A few years after their marriage, Marvin and Ethel picked up stakes and made the move across the state line permanent, settling into a quaint A-frame house on North Summit Avenue in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Small by today's notions, measuring at only 824 square feet, one could imagine living conditions may have been somewhat cramped, as Marvin's father, Peter, also moved in with the couple. However uncomfortable arrangements may have been, the Great Depression was in full swing by this time, and so it wasn't difficult to imagine certain accommodations had to be made. 4 years later, in 1940, Marvin's occupation was listed as being a delivery man for a towel supply company, while his father, then 63 years old and in ill health, was retired. While money may have been tight, this didn't stop Marvin and Ethel from moving forward with their lives, and on June 10th, the happy couple welcomed their first child, a daughter named Judith. Marvin was elated to be a father and doted on his young daughter, but soon, conflicts around the world would step in to interrupt the happy family. On September 16th, the United States instituted the Selective Training and Service Act, which required all men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for the draft. This was the first time in United States history that a draft had been employed during peacetime, though with World War II heating up in Europe, it seemed it would only be a matter of time until the United States became involved. Just 6 months after the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, in May of 1942, Ethel gave birth to their second daughter, Janice, who would quickly become the light of Marvin's life. Now a father twice over, Marvin had to work even harder to take care of his family, and that was a challenge he was surely up for. However, the Second World War was growing more intense, and soon Marvin would be faced with leaving his wife and young daughters to join the fight. On January 30th, 1944, Marvin's name was selected during the draft lottery, and he was officially enlisted into the United States Army. 2 months later, in March, Marvin, along with others from the area, was sent to Fort Snelling in Minnesota to begin training. At the time, it was noted on his record that he had experience and skill as a driver and tractor operator. Like everyone else at the time, Marvin's term of enlistment was defined as being for the duration of the war plus 6 months. His draft card at that time described him as standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 145 pounds. Marvin would go on to serve in the European theater as a member of the 35th 44th Medium Automotive Maintenance Company. He was stationed with Assembly Command in France, where he was involved with the inspection, maintenance, and replacement of jeeps, staff vehicles, trucks, and light and medium tanks to ensure all equipment was operating efficiently and effectively for combat troops. While the European side of World War II ended in May of 45, the Pacific Theater continued on for another 3 months until the Japanese surrender on September 2nd. Having obtained the rank of corporal, Marvin was officially released from the service on Wednesday, November 7th, returning home to South Dakota after being away from his wife and children for 20 months. Upon returning home, Marvin got right back to work supporting the family and spending time with Ethel and his daughters, as well as his father. The whole family continued living at the home on North Summit until nearly a decade after. It was during this period that Marvin became involved in a new career venture. Brandland's advertised itself as a service which cleaned rugs and upholstery, as well as installing carpets and custom-made blinds. Marvin would continue working in this area for the remainder of his life, though not in Sioux Falls. On September 13th, 1953, Marvin's father, Peter, passed away at the age of 75. His obituary says that he had been ill for 15 years and had been in the hospital for several days prior to his passing. Peter's funeral was held in Minnesota, where his beloved wife's had been, and following the service at Zion Lutheran Church, he was buried beside her beneath a simple stone reading Father. Marvin and Ethel remained in Sioux Falls for 6 years after Peter's death, but ultimately would move out of the state in 1959. This time they headed southeast, traveling nearly 200 miles to Fort Dodge, Iowa, the seat of Webster County. Judith, now 19 years old, was engaged to a man named Gary Espinoza. The two were married early in the year, moving into their own place on 6th Street, living just a few miles from Marvin and Ethel. Within 2 years, the couple would become grandparents for the first, and not long after, second time. Life in Fort Dodge was quiet, peaceful, and happy for many years. Marvin continued to work in the rug business. According to several advertisements and papers of the time, he was employed for a period at Size Rug Cleaning and Storage Company alongside his new son-in-law, Gary, among others. Marvin was noted as being a co-manager of the business with 17 years' experience. This business was located on 15th Avenue, less than a mile from the 9th Avenue home of the Brandlands. Moving forward, Marvin and Ethel lived a quiet and happy life together for the next 20 years. They entertained family, spoiled their grandchildren to the best of their ability, and watched their daughters building lives and families for themselves. In the fall of 1982, however, after nearly 50 years of marriage, their lives would be torn apart in the blink of an eye. Regionally, the night before Halloween is referred to by different names. Some places call it Mischief Night, others say Devil's Night. Iowa calls it Beggar's Night. Due to concerns over the safety of younger children, the night before Halloween has been utilized as a time where kids, typically not yet teenagers, are encouraged to go trick-or-treating with their parents rather than mixing in with the older crowd the next day. In 1982, Beggar's Night was scheduled for Saturday, October 30th, between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m., although local papers noted that, for safety reasons, people should stop handing out candy at 7:30. October 30th was a cool, windy night in Fort Dodge, with temperatures peaking in the low 50s. Children clung tight to coats thrown over their costumes as they traversed up and down the town streets, knocking on doors and filling plastic pumpkins with a variety of candy. Both Ethel, now 70 years old, and Marvin, 69, were home that evening, and with a lot of knocks at the door, Ethel was fully prepared with a big bowl of candy waiting nearby. Each time she'd open the door, the couple would smile and ask the children about their costumes. One knock was unrelated to the holiday when one of the couple's granddaughters, Teresa Trueblood, arrived to visit. According to Teresa, it was a nice visit, and there were several trick-or-treaters who stopped by during the time she was there. Though no specific time is given as to when exactly Teresa left the home on 9th Avenue, it's apparently sometime prior to 7:30. In 2010, Teresa sat down for an interview with WHO 13 News and explained leaving that night, saying, quote, "I just told them I'll see you later, and I almost went back into the house to tell them not to answer the door after 7:30. It haunts me to this day that I didn't." End quote. You can see this full video in the Vodacast if you're using the app. The link is in the show notes. At approximately 8:30 p.m., a loud knock echoed through the Brandlands' home. By now, the streets were dark but for the dim glow of what few streetlights existed at the time. Ethel, assuming that this was yet another series of trick-or-treaters, got up from her seat in the living room and approached the door. Unlocking it, she pulled it open and found an odd sight. Rather than a small child or a group of children accompanied by a parent, there loomed a larger figure. The unknown man was not wearing a costume, at least not one would consider a costume by traditional means. The man, dressed in jeans and a plaid shirt, wore a full-sized pillowcase over his head. There were 2 eye holes, likely cut out with scissors. Before Ethel could say anything, the man in a measured tone stated, "Trick or treat, give me your money or I'll shoot you." Ethel laughed, not out of nervousness or fear, but due to the fact that she assumed the man had to be a prankster. In fact, both she and Marvin figured it was someone they knew, maybe a friend or family member pulling their chains for the holiday. Still laughing, Ethel stared at the man for a moment, who didn't make another sound, and believing it was a joke, she reached up towards the pillowcase and began lifting it from his head. Before she could pull the fabric up enough to expose his face, he quickly pushed her hand away and pulled the mask back down. Figuring that the person wasn't there to harm them, and believing it was someone they knew, Ethel turned her back to the man and reached down for the bowl of candy. As she did, the man stepped through the doorway into the house, shutting the door behind him. The sound caught Ethel off guard as she spun around and found herself staring down the barrel of a gun. At this point, she still didn't yet believe it was real, assuming the gun was a toy. Marvin now entered the fray, asking what was going on, and Ethel quickly explained the situation. He too figured this must be some kind of prank. At that moment, however, the man told the couple that he wanted them to lead him down into the basement, where he knew they kept a safe, and he wanted them to open it for him. While at this point, most people would have figured out that maybe this guy wasn't joking around, in a tragic bit of irony, it actually worked to reinforce Marvin and Ethel's beliefs that this was a prank. There was, in fact, a safe in the basement, but hardly anyone outside of immediate family were aware of its existence. Since the armed man knew about it, it seemed more than likely that he had to be someone they knew really well. Unfortunately, though, they were about to find out just how serious this man was. He waved the gun at the couple and began herding them into the kitchen, where a door led to the basement steps. With each step forward, the reality of the situation began to settle in for Marvin and Ethel, though there was still a sense, at least for Marvin, that this couldn't possibly be a real robbery. While there was a safe in the basement, they were never wealthy people. So anyone who knew of the safe had to have also known that it wasn't stocked with thousands of dollars in expensive jewelry. Growing frustrated with the circumstances and a prank he felt had gone on far enough, Marvin refused to go down into the basement. The armed assailant insisted that he wasn't playing around. Standing in the tight quarters of their small kitchen, the suspect was within Marvin's reach, and so he decided to put an end to the charade. Lunging forward, he grabbed the man's gun. A struggle ensued for a few seconds, before the deafening blast of a gunshot rang out. A bullet struck Marvin in the front of his throat, though early news articles incorrectly said he'd been shot in the chest. Marvin crumbled to the floor, reaching up for his throat, which by this point was bleeding profusely, as Ethel looked on in horror. Then the shooter did something for which there is no logical explanation. Reaching up, he lifted the pillowcase from his head, dropping it down on the floor before turning and running back out the front door, disappearing into the night. Panicked and frightened, Ethel struggled to grab the phone and quickly dialed 911. Police and EMTs raced towards the scene and found Marvin alive, but in bad shape. They quickly loaded him into an ambulance and made the 2-mile drive across the Des Moines River to Trinity Regional Medical Center. Ethel was taken to the hospital where she watched as Marvin was quickly wheeled away by a slew of medical personnel trying to assess damage while getting the bleeding under control. She made several phone calls to family members alerting them of the situation, which caught everyone by surprise. Of all of the things that could have happened, why would anyone ever want to hurt Marvin? He was known in the community as a kind, giving older man who would help anyone if they needed it. Now he needed all the help he could get. Doctors at Trinity quickly determined that the damage caused by the bullet was far more extensive than they'd first thought, and decided he needed to be rushed into surgery by doctors with more experience. Quickly, they placed a call and requested the assistance of Life Flight, an organization which supplies helicopters, planes, and ambulances to quickly transfer critically wounded patients to different medical facilities. Less than an hour after being shot, Marvin was loaded onto a helicopter and sent nearly 100 miles south to Mercy Hospital Medical Center in Des Moines. Ethel was directed to return to her home and gather up a list of all the medications Marvin was taking so the doctors could be aware of any complications they might run into. Her granddaughter, Teresa, having arrived at the hospital, gave her a ride back to the 9th Avenue home. When the two women arrived, they found a chaotic scene. A crowd of curious neighbors had gathered around the house, which was flooded with police. Though not an officer herself, Teresa couldn't help but feel like investigators on the scene had done little to secure it from contamination. She later told WHO 13 that there were all kinds of people in the house, gathered in the kitchen, living room, and outside on the front lawn. Essentially, the two had to push their way through a crowd just to get inside where, for Teresa, the terrifying reality finally settled in. She later explained, quote, "You walk in and you're just in disbelief that it's happening until you see the blood, and then you know it's real." End quote. When Marvin arrived at Mercy Hospital, surgeons, informed ahead of time, were already prepped to begin doing whatever they could to try and save him. It was a long and difficult procedure. The bullet had entered the front of Marvin's throat, and even the slightest nick in any of the major veins or arteries there could result in death. Surgeons worked for hours to try and get Marvin back, but he was slipping away. At approximately 9:30 a.m. on Sunday, October 31st, just 12 hours after being shot, Marvin Brandland was pronounced dead. Ethel was absolutely devastated. The family had gone numb, and friends and neighbors were shocked. Just hours after his murder, newspapers around the country published accounts of the story under headlines such as "Masked Trick-or-Treater Kills Man." The Fort Dodge Police Department, under then Chief Donald Hensley, were investigating the shooting, but almost from the get-go, the family didn't have a lot of faith in their abilities. They wanted the state's Division of Criminal Investigation involved, but Chief Hensley didn't think it was necessary. The Messenger newspaper later reported that, when asked why he hadn't called in the DCI, Chief Hensley explained that his officers were highly trained and more than capable of handling the investigation themselves. He notified the DCI, but did not request their assistance. At least for her part, Teresa Trueblood disagreed, noting the crowd of people she'd seen in her grandparents' home when she'd brought Ethel back. She later commented to the Messenger, quote, "There were all kinds of people in there. You couldn't even walk through the kitchen. Aren't you supposed to preserve a crime scene?" End quote. Fort Dodge Police Sergeant Ivan Metzger was placed in charge of the investigation and immediately dispatched officers to begin canvassing the neighborhood in hopes that someone may have seen the suspect, either as he approached the Brandlands' home or, more preferably, after he'd run out without his mask on. The first and most important witness for investigators was Ethel herself, the only person alive who had managed to see the shooter after he'd taken his mask off. Ethel described the shooter as a white male dressed in a plaid shirt and blue jeans, standing approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She thought he was young, estimating his age to have been between 16 and 20. Asked if she could think of anyone who would have reason to want to harm them, Ethel couldn't think of anyone. She did, however, note to investigators that only close friends and family were aware of the safe in the basement, and so police began operating under the belief that the shooter was likely someone who had a connection either to Marvin or another family member. Ethel hadn't recognized the killer, and so it was unlikely this was someone who had been to the house with any frequency. However, investigators felt that the murder had happened so fast, and Ethel had been in such a state of shock, she may not have paid as much attention to his face as she was rushing to try and help Marvin. Several neighbors reported hearing the gunshot that night, though with it being the eve of Halloween, they'd assumed it had been local kids pulling pranks. Unfortunately, police couldn't find a single witness who actually saw the man approaching or leaving the home, though they did get multiple reports of a suspicious figure. Neighbors told investigators that they'd seen someone lurking in the area who seemed too old to be out trick-or-treating that night. When police called in a sketch artist to work with the witnesses, they quickly found themselves facing a problem. It appeared that two separate people were being described. In response, investigators had two composite sketches drawn up, though they didn't have a lot of faith in either. According to the Messenger, one individual had been described as carrying a paper sack with no pillowcase in sight. The other did have a pillowcase with him, but based on witness descriptions, it didn't match the one dropped by the killer in the Brandlands' home. Sergeant Metzger would later state that while they circulated the composites, neither man was considered a suspect, and really, they just hoped to track them down because if they had been in the neighborhood, then maybe they had seen the actual shooter that night. Police did have the killer's mask, which he'd inexplicably left behind. This was taken into evidence and processed for fingerprints, though it doesn't appear that any were ever found. A full forensics analysis of the material provided no new answers, and unfortunately, in 1982, DNA was not yet involved in investigations. The first patent on techniques to utilize DNA for forensics wouldn't even be filed until the next year, and it would be several more years before this became an option accessible to most law enforcement agencies. As such, police kept the pillowcase in their evidence room, where it would stay untouched for years. By the morning of Monday, November 1st, Sergeant Metzger told reporters that they didn't have any suspects or leads, but that interviews with neighbors would continue throughout the day, while other investigators swept through the area looking for any potential evidence the killer may have left behind. Dr. R.C. Wooters, the Polk County medical examiner, had conducted an autopsy on Marvin not long after he died. Wooters later stated that Marvin had suffered a single fatal gunshot wound to the front of his neck and that the bullet did not exit his body. According to the Des Moines Register, during the autopsy, Dr. Wooters retrieved the bullet from Marvin's body and identified it as a .32 caliber. Following the examination, Marvin's body was released into the custody of the Bruce Funeral Home, where arrangements were made for a funeral service to occur on Wednesday, November 3rd. Following the funeral, Marvin was interred at Fort Dodge Memorial Park beneath a simple placard listing him as a veteran of World War II. More than a week passed since the shooting, and police were still investigating without a suspect or any solid leads. Outside of the type of gun used in the pillowcase, investigators told reporters they had no real clues in their search for answers. In hopes of drumming up some tips, police placed the two composite drawings in several areas around town, including the nearby mall. In order to assist in the investigation, members of the Webster County Fort Dodge Citizens for the Prevention of Crime offered a $1,000 reward for anyone who could provide information leading to an arrest. While tips did come in, and police ran them down, nothing led them any closer to uncovering the killer's identity, at least according to them. The family, however, disagreed. Several family members, upon being given a description of the shooter, gathered up the names of people who fit the physical traits described by Ethel and handed them over to investigators. Detectives, however, would later tell the media that while they had received names, everyone they'd interviewed managed to provide them with a solid alibi for their whereabouts on the night of the shooting. Unfortunately, almost from the first step of the investigation, the case was already growing cold. Police tracked down several leads, questioned multiple people, and followed up on tips called in, but again, they all seemed to lead to dead ends. It was an extremely difficult time for the family, who were now moving steadily towards the holiday season without Marvin, something Ethel really struggled with. Without her husband of 46 years, she began sinking into depression. Thanksgiving fell on Thursday, November 25th, and surrounded by her family, Ethel just fell to pieces. Her daughter, Jan Horton, later stated, quote, "She was eating, and she just quit eating, and she broke down, and she cried and cried and cried." End quote. Ethel was inconsolable, and there was little anyone could do to reach her. She was heartbroken, frightened, and didn't want to be alone. It didn't help that the case had already fallen out of the headlines, and what progress investigators had made was little at best. Not long after the holiday, the DCI became involved in the case. They started looking over the work conducted by the Fort Dodge police. In a letter written by then DCI Chief Gerald Shanahan, he stated that the original investigators had used acceptable investigative techniques, noting that they'd secured the crime scene, worked with the crime lab, and photographed the location and all important evidence. In addition, Shanahan wrote that investigators had conducted an extensive neighborhood canvass and followed up on all logical leads, but to no avail. Some members of the family, though, felt police had more than enough information to break the case, yet they hadn't. Unfortunately, by the end of 1982, the investigation into Marvin's murder was apparently stalled. Police had run out of leads, tips had dried up, and they didn't have enough evidence to expand much on their suspect pool. They'd spoken to family members, friends, neighbors, and coworkers of Marvin's, but they couldn't get a good bead on anyone in particular. Though they didn't state it affirmatively, many members of the family began to get the feeling that the police didn't see an arrest coming any time in the near future, at least not without some major break in the case. For Ethel, each passing day became more difficult, and the pain and sadness she endured were unbearable. She began to decline both psychologically and physically. Many felt that, due to her broken heart, she'd lost the will to live. 9 months after Marvin was killed on Wednesday, July 20th, 1983, Ethel passed away at the age of 71. Following a funeral service, she was laid to rest beside Marvin under a placard reading, "Beloved Wife." For the family, it was another difficult loss, and for many, it felt like the man who had murdered Marvin was just as responsible for Ethel's death. Asked about the passing of her mother, Jan later stated, quote, "Mom relived Beggar's night 1982 over and over because she was there when it happened. She was living in fear. She tried to put her life back together, but she was just so depressed." End quote. The investigation grew silent, and for the family, that was unacceptable. They spoke to the media and tried to keep a light shining on the case, but the media had long since turned away from it. In frustration, at a city council meeting in 1984, Jan confronted Chief Hensley about the department's failure to make an arrest or advance the investigation. Asked about that later, Jan explained, quote, "I guess I wanted to get some attention on it and get it brought out in the open on why there has been nothing more done." End quote. Unfortunately, while her tactic had worked in the moment, it wouldn't last. There were no arrests coming, and soon, days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. In 2009, 27 years after the murder, the DCI announced they'd be going over the files of 150 cold cases, and Marvin's was one of them. The hope at the time was that new eyes might find information original investigators had missed, and that maybe advancements in technology might give them the ability to discover something that couldn't be detected in 1982. With this announcement came several new newspaper articles and interviews about the case. Speaking to the Messenger, Teresa was hopeful that the passage of time might have loosened some people's lips, saying, quote, "I just think people know. They just didn't want to talk. And maybe with the time that's passed, they might want to talk. Maybe somebody will pop up with new information, or somebody's heard somebody say something. I want to see what was done, what was said, and those different things. I just think something's been overlooked, or they're not looking at it." End quote. It was around the same time that the family revealed, for the first time publicly, that not only did they have an idea of who may have committed the crime, they'd handed his name over to investigators years earlier. This person, whose name has never been publicly released, was described as an acquaintance of the family who closely fits the physical description given by Ethel to investigators the night of the murder. According to the family, this person not only fit the physical description, but allegedly bragged about having gotten away with the murder. Asked about this, investigators stated that they were aware of the suspect and had questioned him previously, but they hadn't been able to produce any evidence to actually link him to the crime. According to detectives, the unnamed man is a prime suspect in the case, but Ethel was the only person who could positively identify him, and she was no longer there. Asked about this, Teresa confirmed that they felt they knew who had killed Marvin. She explained, quote, "For the longest time, we didn't pursue anything because we knew in our stomachs, in our gut, who it was. But there was fear, and Grandma always lived in fear. But I know they would want it solved. They'd want us safe. We owe it to them." End quote. The Fort Dodge Police Department has undergone extensive criticism and scrutiny for their handling of the case, a case which many believe should have been solved. The family's been incredibly hard on investigators, and rightfully so, but police themselves don't believe they failed during the course of the investigation, arguing that they did everything they could. Kevin Doty, Assistant Chief of Police for Fort Dodge, later explained, quote, "Everybody that was on the department, everybody in town wanted to see the case solved at the time it happened, and we wanted to get it to the point where not only can you charge somebody, but you can take the case to trial and get a conviction and not leave anything to doubt. The detectives couldn't get to that point." End quote. 1 year later, in 2010, the decision was made to remove the killer's pillowcase mass from evidence and submit it to a lab for DNA testing. With technology far more advanced than it was in 1982, the hope was that the suspect may have left behind DNA in the form of moisture from his breath, hairs, or perhaps mere contact with his skin. Asked about progress on the testing, DCI spokesperson Courtney Green explained, quote, "I think they're hoping in the next 30 days they might have some information. Then again, if it's part of an ongoing investigation, it could be confidential. So even though we know the results, we may not be able to release that information." End quote. The family waited with eager anticipation for the results of the DNA analysis, but unfortunately, they would be disappointed yet again. While DNA was discovered on the pillowcase, there wasn't enough to generate a profile which could be utilized for comparison against another DNA sample. The sample simply didn't have enough material to confirm any potential hits. You can read more about this in the Vodacast. The link is in the show notes. Jessica Lown of the DCI later said that while this had been a letdown, there was still some hope. She explained, quote, "Technology has evolved, and today we were able to extract some information. We didn't get everything we wanted, but who knows what will happen in the next couple of years." End quote. Of course, I should note, 11 years have passed since this test was run, and it doesn't appear there have been any new tests or that any are scheduled. Unfortunately, there have been no major updates in the case since 2010. The prime suspect in the case is described as being a white male with blondish hair and blue eyes, standing 5 feet 8 inches tall. At the time of the murder, Ethel estimated his age to be between 16 and 20, which means if alive today, he would be between the ages of 55 and 60. This man, believed to be known to the family, was aware of a safe in the Brandlands' basement, the location of their home, and its layout. Marvin was shot with a .38 caliber handgun, which has never been recovered. The suspect is known to have bragged about the crime and likely has committed others. Undoubtedly, there are people out there who knew the shooter and possess the ability to provide investigators with the information they need to finally identify Marvin's killer. 69-year-old Marvin Brandland was a family man, a husband, father, brother, and grandfather. He worked hard to provide for his family. He fought for his country in the Second World War and he did all he could to ensure those he loved were taken care of. Then one cold October night, an unknown assailant bent on robbery shot and killed him before his time. In the aftermath, his wife Ethel couldn't go on and succumbed to her grief less than a year later. In a matter of seconds, the shooter ended a 46-year marriage, destroyed Ethel's life, and shattered a family. 39 long years have passed since Marvin Brandland was shot down in his own home. It's far too long to go without answers for a family that's endured so much grief and anguish. While the passage of time can never erase that pain, the strong find a way to push through and continue on with their lives. But there will always be those lingering questions, that anger, that desire to see someone pay for what they've done. Asked about the case all these years later, Jan replied, quote, "When you take a tragedy like that and it's just taken away from the family like that, it will always be with you. You'll never, never forget it." October 30th, 1982. Sometime between 8:30 and 9 p.m., a man wearing a pillowcase with eye holes cut out knocks on the door of Marvin and Ethel's 9th Avenue home. He threatens to shoot unless he's led down into the basement and granted access to their safe. Believing it must be some kind of a Halloween prank, Marvin grabs for the gun to end the joke, and moments later he's shot through the front of his neck with a .38 caliber. The killer then strips off the pillowcase, drops it to the floor, and runs out into the night. 39 years later, and his identity remains a mystery due to a lack of evidence to connect him to the crime. Marvin's case has been discussed on a lot of different podcasts over the years. Generally speaking, there isn't a lot of solid information about the case available for analysis, and so it can be difficult to get a handle on what exactly went down. While the police would argue that the case was handled to the best of their ability at the time, some family members feel they weren't exactly putting everything they had into it. Not out of a lack of care or interest in solving the murder, but seemingly due to a lack of experience in handling a case like this. There's a lot of questions looming around this case, and there are seemingly no answers available to satisfy them. Unlike a lot of cases covered on Trace Evidence, we don't have a list of several different theories and multiple persons of interest. So all we can really do is look at what we know for sure, what evidence exists, and see where it leads. Marvin and Ethel moved from South Dakota to Fort Dodge, Iowa around 1959. For more than 20 years, they lived quiet, peaceful lives in their 9th Street home in the south end of town. Marvin begins working for a carpet business and eventually becomes the owner of his own shop, carving out a living for his family. This wasn't a highly lucrative business, and Marvin was by no means a rich man, but it was enough to take care of the bills, the house, and what expenses came along. It seems strange to me that Marvin would become the target of a plan for robbery given this information, but at the same time, with Ethel describing the suspect as between 16 and 20, maybe it wasn't about netting a massive haul. We've all heard of cases where someone was killed for as little as $5 or $10, so I suppose it's not entirely out of the question. I did, however, find it interesting that in at least one interview, Teresa Trueblood speculated about the killer's motive. In 2009, she stated that while police believed robbery had to be the initial factor which brought the killer to the Brandlands' home that night, she didn't think that made sense. Anyone who knew Marvin enough to be aware of the safe in the basement would also likely have known he wasn't packing away large sums of cash. At the same time, I do think it's worth noting that we're talking about two people who had lived through the Depression, and for many of that generation, they had little faith in banks and often kept what money they did have somewhere in their homes. Neither the family or investigators, however, have ever suggested that very much money was in the safe. Discussing the possibility that this wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, Teresa told the Messenger, quote, "They never had any money around there. They were older people. I think there's more to it." End quote. So I suppose the question becomes, did the killer go to the home that night with a plan only of robbing the couple, or was killing Marvin always a part of that plan? It's hard to imagine why someone would want to kill Marvin, but given that we don't know a whole lot about his life in Iowa, there's no way of knowing for certain one way or the other. Everyone who knew him seemed to think highly of him. He was described as a good family man who went out of his way to help others. At the same time, you really never know what seemingly insignificant interaction might be interpreted as a reason to kill by someone with an inclination to do so. Knowing that Marvin ran a business, I don't think it's out of the question that it could have been as simple as firing someone or a dispute over pay with an employee. In the end, however, it's all speculation. So was this an execution or a robbery gone wrong? On the one hand, the way the crime has been described, the killer didn't execute Marvin in cold blood, but shot him in the midst of a struggle. It's never been made adequately clear whether or not investigators believe the gunshot was an accident or if the killer managed to pull the weapon away from the struggle and then aimed and fired. I think it goes without saying, even if this person did plan to commit a murder that night, I doubt he was looking to do it before getting access to the safe. I think, based on the fact that he ran out of the house immediately after shooting Marvin, things did not go the way he'd planned. I'd be inclined to lead towards the shooting itself being accidental, not to say that would absolve the suspect of the horrible crime he committed. If you walk into someone's home and aim a loaded gun at them, then whatever happens from that point forward is entirely your fault, and the full weight of the legal system should come crashing down on you. Unfortunately, as we know, that didn't happen here, and this monster managed to live for many years after Marvin's murder and Ethel's death. Both the family and police say that a key piece of evidence in the case was that the killer demanded access to the safe, which he specified was in the basement. Now, according to the family, the only people who knew that safe was down there were people who were close. This is, of course, one of the primary reasons that investigators began looking at anyone who had connections to Marvin and his relatives. This could include other family members, co-workers, neighbors, and friends. However, there is somewhat of a contradiction out there which muddies this up for me. Several times, the person the family believes responsible has been described as an acquaintance. Now, maybe it means different things to different people, but to me, an acquaintance is someone I know and I'm friendly with, but I'm not going to be sharing any important information about my life or financial situation with them. I'm surely not going to mention I've got a safe in my basement. Of course, sometimes things just slip out. Maybe an offhanded remark about putting something in the safe. Or maybe a family member or close friend mentions it to someone else for an unknown reason, and that knowledge begins to germinate in the killer's mind. You could speculate about it endlessly, but if anyone knows for certain how this person knew about the safe, they haven't shared that publicly. There is one detail of this case, though, that's been nagging at me since I began researching it. If family members believe they know who the killer was, if this was someone known to the family, how did Ethel not recognize him? According to police, she described him as between 16 and 20 with blondish hair and blue eyes, standing 5'8". After shooting Marvin, the killer inexplicably removed the pillowcase from his head, dropping it to the floor before running out. In that moment, Ethel was able to see his face, and I find it hard to believe that if she recognized him, she wouldn't have just told the police that. Obviously, it was a traumatizing situation, and everything happened so fast it's possible she didn't get as good of a look as she needed, but I think it's safe to say if this was someone that she knew well, she'd have known his name. So that brings me back to the acquaintance description. Since Ethel didn't recognize the shooter, I'm led to believe that his connection to the family was through someone else. Was he friends with someone who was close to the family and had been to the house a time or two, but only in passing? Had he helped in the home in some way, maybe doing an odd job like mowing the lawn or delivering a package? Given his age, he could have been friends with or associated with one of their grandkids. Could he have worked for Marvin at some point in time, and maybe up until the time of the crime, and in desperation to get his hands on some cash, decided to target the owner, who he imagined had to have had more money than he claimed? There's a lot of different possibilities here, including that maybe it was simply someone who saw Marvin and Ethel as an older couple who likely wouldn't put up much of a fight. I imagine when Marvin lunged for the gun, this guy was caught off guard and freaked out. At the same time, Teresa mentioned in an interview she took part in that the family believed they knew who the killer was, but there was a fear about naming him. To repeat her exact words, they were, quote, For the longest time, we didn't pursue anything because we knew in our stomachs, in our gut, who it was. But there was fear, and Grandma always lived in fear. End quote. Was there fear of retribution? That he might kill another member of the family or commit some other kind of crime against them? At one point, it was mentioned that this suspect bragged about killing Marvin, 2 members of the family. So was this someone known to them as dangerous to a point where they'd be afraid to turn him in? He killed Marvin, so I think it follows that he was capable of killing others or committing some other crime against them. I would still find it very difficult to believe Ethel wouldn't have named the shooter, regardless of how frightening he was, if she knew his name. Although again, I know there's no answer to this question. I've always also wondered why the killer left the pillowcase behind. He had to have known he may have left evidence, fingerprints, hairs, something that could identify him. He could have easily run out of the house while still wearing the mask and taken it off when he wasn't standing directly in front of the woman whose husband he just shot. Maybe it was something that just happened in the moment, his own shocked response to what had happened. Maybe it had gotten all twisted up during the struggle with Marvin and he couldn't see out the eye holes anymore. Maybe he wanted Ethel to see his face for one reason or another. Like so much of this case, it just doesn't make any sense to me. There's got to be more going on. Some who have looked at this case have suggested the possibility that the killer's knowledge of the house, or at least the presence of the safe, may have been information given to the suspect for the purpose of committing the crime by someone else. Maybe someone who was close to the family, or someone who had worked with or known Marvin for a long enough time to be trusted, decided to put someone else to attempting a robbery. It wouldn't have been that complicated. Tell him there's a safe in the basement, work out that Beggar's night is the perfect time to do it, arrange some split of the cash with him. I haven't seen anything to lend much credence to this theory, but it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. I suppose the primary issue I have with it, I find it hard to believe someone that young, confronted with a potential murder charge, would be able to stonewall police during the interview. At the same time, if he had a decent lawyer, he wouldn't have had to have said much at all. Certainly a possibility, though I think a little less likely than the killer working on his own. Unfortunately, this is one of those cases where it's extremely difficult to accept that, even 39 years later, there hasn't been a resolution. Both the police and members of the family agree that there is a prime suspect, but not enough evidence to actually make an arrest or more likely to obtain a conviction. In so many cases, it's all a mystery. Who could have done it and why? Here we have a person who was in the right age range at the time, fit the physical description, allegedly bragged about the crime, and was familiar enough with the family to have known about the safe in the basement. Several family members believe investigators had enough information at the time to arrest the suspect, but police have said the lack of evidence would make it unlikely they could have successfully brought the case to trial. I can't begin to imagine the anger, grief, and frustration of believing you know who killed your father and grandfather, but not being able to do anything about it. Now, the suspect's name has never been publicly revealed, but that doesn't mean you couldn't find it if you really wanted to. Throughout researching this episode, I came across several different names that were, at one time or another, considered possible. It becomes a matter of narrowing down that list of suspects based off of Ethel's description and available information about the crime itself. There was one name that I came across far more than any other, and looking into that individual, a lot seems to match up. When you factor in where he lived at the time, approximately a mile or two away from the crime scene, and his extensive rap sheet, it's difficult to believe anyone else could have done it. Does that prove this is the right person? As it currently stands, there doesn't appear to be a way to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. There's really no way of knowing for certain who the suspect might be, at least not without being directly told by someone connected to the investigation. And unfortunately, the Freedom of Information Act requests I sent to Iowa were denied. That's fairly common when a case is still open. In the past 4 years, only around 5% of FOIAs I've sent out have actually resulted in receiving case files and information. I'd never want to do anything to harm an ongoing investigation, so I'm not going to share the name of the person I was looking into. I will, however, note that this person passed away some years ago, so if indeed he was the one responsible, we may never see an actual arrest, though we can hope that as technology continues to advance, we'll eventually learn of a full DNA profile being developed from the pillowcase. 39 years ago, 69-year-old Marvin Brandland was shot and killed in his own kitchen by a would-be thief who hid his face beneath a pillowcase. The gunman managed to escape, and over the course of the nearly 4 decades that have passed, he has never had to face justice for taking Marvin's life and destroying his family. Whether or not the killer is still alive or has passed away, one thing that everyone seems to agree on is the fact that there are others out there with information that could be used to advance this case. So much time has passed. Anyone who's been holding on to a secret needs to come forward so that Marvin and Ethel's families might finally have a chance of obtaining some sense of closure. Unfortunately, until someone does come forward, technology unlocks the secret of the pillowcase, or investigators get a major break. The murder of Marvin Brandland will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the murder of Marvin Brandland, the Des Moines Register and Gazette covered this case fairly well back in 1982. I'd also highly recommend visiting iowacoldcases.org, where they've gathered together much of the available information on this case. You can see that page now in Vodacast. The link is in the show notes. If you have any information about the murder of Marvin Brandland, please contact Iowa's Division of Criminal Investigation at 515-725-6010. This is case number 82-05814. You can also contact the Fort Dodge Police Department at 515-573-1426. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Trace Evidence would not be possible without support from amazing listeners like you. And now I'd like to take a moment to thank our fantastic Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Anne Bertram, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Dave Allen, Denise Dingsdale, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Eric Sumter, Heather Louise, James, Jennifer Winkler, Jill Sentz, Joni Berkowitz, Kara Moreland, Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Marla Wright, Melissa Brickeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Quinn McBreen, Robert Jansen, Sarah Lebanon, Travis Skepko, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Taylor, Tom Archer, Tom Radford, and Tracy Woods. Your contributions to Trace Evidence are invaluable, and your support of the show is both appreciated and extremely humbling. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence and gaining access to exclusive merch and ad-free episodes, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence or go to trace-evidence.com and click on the support option. That concludes this week's episode. I want to thank you all for listening and wish you a happy, safe, and healthy Halloween. And I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.